In the ashes of war, something survived that should not have. Villages were burned to the ground between 1942 and 1945, their houses collapsing into charred beams, their fields turned black under falling fire. Families vanished, their names erased from record, their lives reduced to smoke carried on the wind. Yet in one village, when the embers cooled and the ruins were sifted through, words were found, words that should have burned with the rest. They were diaries, scorched but legible, their covers blackened, their pages curled and brittle, but their handwriting still clear. Children's scrawls beside the careful script of women, the sharper strokes of men, each entry a fragment of life that had no right to endure when everything else was gone. The words spoke of hunger, of fear, of the sound of boots on frozen ground. But as the pages turned, they spoke of other things too, things that did not belong to the ordinary weight of war. Whispers that filled the night, figures glimpsed in smoke, fires that started where no flame had been lit. The village itself was gone, nothing more than rubble and silence. Yet the diaries carried voices into the years beyond, voices that seemed to resist death. They told stories of shadows moving across windows when houses were already empty, of children who drew circles in soot and refused to explain their meaning, of dreams that spread from one sleeper to another until no one could tell if they were awake. They told of fear, not only of soldiers, but of something else, something that walked among the ruins before the fires had even come. What unsettled those who read the diaries was not only what they described, but how they seemed to know. One entry, written days before the attack, described the flames as if they had already happened. Another named those who would be lost before their deaths were confirmed. The handwriting was steady, the words precise, as if the writer was not recording life, but repeating something already seen. The war was filled with stories of suffering, and most of them vanished without record. But these words remained, clinging to the scorched pages, refusing to be silenced. And the question left behind was more disturbing than the ruins themselves. Why did the diaries survive when everybody turned to ash? Why were the words spared when the voices that wrote them were consumed? The village was small, hidden among low hills and forest, the kind of place where life had once been measured by the rhythm of harvest and prayer. Children ran barefoot along dirt lanes, bells rang from a small chapel, and smoke from hearths rose in the evenings in a steady line of peace. But by 1942, that rhythm had been broken. War had pushed its shadow across every field and doorstep, and the village no longer belonged to itself. Soldiers passed through with boots that left mud and blood on wooden floors, families whispered of raids, and food became as rare as laughter. It was in this world that the diaries began. At first they were ordinary records of daily struggle. A mother wrote of the long walks to barter for bread, her words heavy with exhaustion. A boy no older than 10 wrote clumsy lines about missing his father and the ache of hunger that did not leave his belly. An older man wrote about the farm he once tended, the cattle taken, the barns empty. But beneath the surface of ordinary hardship, a darker thread began to grow. The words shifted from complaint to confession, from simple accounts to warnings. One diary spoke of nights when the village felt wrong, when silence stretched too deep, when the air itself seemed to hum with a presence that was not the wind. Another described fires that burned low in stoves long after they had been doused, as if flame itself resisted being put out. Children began to speak of voices calling from the fields, and when they were asked who spoke to them, they gave names that no one in the village recognized. The diaries became not only journals, but testimonies of unease, written by hands that trembled, as if afraid of what they were recording. The village tried to hold together, tried to explain away the strange events as fear, hunger, or imagination. But the diaries did not agree. They repeated the same details across different writers, patterns too clear to be coincidence. Strange lights in the forest, figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, dreams that spread from one household to another like an infection of the mind. By the time soldiers set fire to the village and left it in ruin, its people had already been broken by something more than war. The flames consumed wood and stone, but not the words. And when the ashes were cold, the diaries remained as if waiting to be found. Their survival felt deliberate, as though the village itself had chosen what to leave behind. They carried voices that war could not erase, voices that whispered of something deeper than invasion, of something that had walked among them even as the world above was tearing itself apart. The first pages of the diaries spoke of hunger and fear, but as the months unfolded, the writing changed, as though the village itself was tilting into something unexplainable. A child's notebook, its edges singed, began with simple sketches of animals and fields, yet over time the drawings darkened. Houses appeared with no doors, trees without leaves and faces without eyes. The air and writing grew hurried, frantic, lines pressed so hard into the paper they almost cut through. In the margin of one page the boy had written a sentence over and over until the ink blurred. "They are already inside." No one knew who he meant. Another diary, belonging to a young woman, started with descriptions of her chores, of carrying water and tending to her siblings, but soon her entries grew troubled. She wrote of nights when the house filled with smoke, though the fire in the hearth had gone out, of hearing footsteps pacing in the loft above, though the family never used that space. She described a dream that came again and again, villagers standing in the square, their faces blurred, their mouths open as if screaming, yet no sound escaping. In her final entry, written days before the village was burned, she wrote that she no longer knew whether she was dreaming or awake, because the silence of the dream had followed her into the day. What unsettled investigators years later were the overlapping details. Separate diaries, written in different hands, described the same nights of unease, the same sights of figures crossing through fields long after curfew. One entry mentioned a woman standing outside in the snow, her dress untouched by frost, her face turned toward the village but never moving. Another, written by someone else on the same date, described the same woman in the same place. Both entries ended with the same words: "She is waiting." The contradictions grew sharper as the war closed in. Diaries mentioned neighbors who were already dead, speaking as though they were still alive, walking the streets, whispering warnings. Some entries predicted fires before they happened, entire houses reduced to ash days after they were described in ink. Others foretold deaths with unsettling accuracy, names written in lists that later matched the official casualty reports. Wet. Her coincidence, intuition, or something beyond explanation, the pattern was undeniable. The diaries were not only recording events, they were anticipating them. By the time the soldiers set fire to the village in 1945, the diaries had already described the flames. One entry simply read, "The houses will fall, the children will not run. The air will burn, but the words will stay." And that was what happened. The houses fell, the children never ran. The air itself turned black with smoke, but the words endured, carried out of the ashes like survivors when no living body remained. When fragments of the diaries were finally gathered and studied, they did not align into a single coherent story, but rather into overlapping voices, each one insisting on its truth. Scholars handled the charred pages carefully, as if afraid the ink might still burn. The first thing they noticed was that the handwriting did not simply deteriorate with fear, it fractured. Sentences ended mid-thought, words repeated without reason, as though the writers were hearing echoes of themselves. One page bore 3 separate hands, layered over one another, yet the entries all described the same event, the sound of crying from a house already reduced to rubble. How 3 people wrote of the same moment in 3 different ways remained a mystery. Some of the strangest pieces were the ones least damaged by fire. A diary belonging to a young girl was nearly intact, its cover scorched, but its words clear. Early entries told of her family, of her favorite places to play, of the simple joys of bread and honey. But later, the writing shifted. She described sitting in class and realizing that half the children around her had no shadows, though the sun was strong that day. She wrote of staring at her own hands and feeling they were not hers, as though something else was moving her fingers across the page. Her final entry ended abruptly with a single line written in a trembling scrawl: "We are already gone." Another volume, this one belonging to a local priest, revealed something far more unsettling. He wrote of parishioners confessing to dreams that were not theirs, memories of lives they had never lived. One man described watching his own funeral. Another claimed he remembered building houses in the village centuries before. The priest grew frightened of what he heard, but continued to record it all in the margins of his diary. His final note, written in haste, claimed he had heard the dead reciting prayers at the altar long after the church roof had fallen. Historians tried to dismiss these accounts as trauma, as the fevered minds of people trapped by hunger and war, but the consistency across the diaries was difficult to ignore. Different authors described the same figures in the fields, the same dreams, the same woman in the snow. Skeptics argued that villagers influenced one another, that fear spread like contagion, yet others saw in the words a pattern too deliberate to be accident. The most troubling discovery came when the diaries were cross-referenced with official records. In one entry, a boy wrote that his sister would die on the 11th day of the month, naming her in clear script. The record confirmed her death on that date, though the boy himself perished weeks earlier. Another diary described the night the village would burn, written in detail days before soldiers reached it. How the dead could write of futures they would never see remains unexplained. The diaries did not simply preserve memory. They blurred it, twisted it, and extended it beyond the limits of life. They were not only accounts but warnings, written by hands that may have already belonged to the dead. The discovery of the diaries should have brought closure, but instead it deepened the wounds. Families who had already grieved for children, parents and siblings found themselves confronted by words that felt alive, words that carried the voices of the dead back into the present. Some could not bear to read them, afraid of what they might find written by hands they once held. Others clutched the pages in desperation, reading them over and over as if hoping to hear a familiar laugh between the lines, as if memory could be resurrected through ink. But the more they read, the less comfort they found. The diaries did not soothe, they unsettled. Their words felt too heavy, too deliberate, like they were written for the living who would come later, rather than for the time they were born in. Villagers who remained near the ruins described an unease that never left them. Some claimed that after handling the diaries they could not sleep without dreams filled with fire, their houses collapsing, their families burning before their eyes. Others spoke of hearing voices at night, faint whispers coming from corners of their homes. Voices they swore sounded like those they had lost. There were stories of people who tried to destroy the diaries again, tossing them into flames, only to find the pages spared once more, the writing blackened, but still legible, as if the words themselves refused erasure. The psychological toll spread like infection. Readers of the diaries carried the weight into their daily lives. A teacher who had taken one of the volumes for safekeeping found himself unable to stand before his class, convinced that the children's eyes were following him with suspicion, as if they knew something he did not. A mother who read the diary of a girl the same age as her own daughter confessed that she began to forget which child was hers, the voice of the dead intruding into her care for the living. The diaries blurred memory and grief until people no longer trusted their own minds. Generations later, the weight had not lifted. Descendants of those who once lived in the village still spoke of inherited dreams, of waking with the smell of smoke in their rooms, though no fire burnt nearby. The diaries had become objects of quiet dread, locked away in archives, but even from behind glass they unsettled those who studied them. Archivists spoke of feeling watched in empty rooms, of sudden chills when reading the entries aloud. The trauma had seeped from the pages into the living, spreading across decades, as if grief itself had found a way to survive through ink. The village was gone, reduced to ash and ruin, yet its sorrow lived on in the minds of those who touched its remnants. The diaries were not simply records of loss. They were instruments of it, carrying the pain forward, ensuring that the village never truly disappeared. When the diaries were first recovered, officials tried to frame them as ordinary records of extraordinary times. They argued that the writings were simply the testimonies of frightened villagers, preserved by chance rather than design. Fire does not always consume evenly, they reminded those who questioned. Some paper survives in pockets where heat passes quickly. Yet even among archivists who catalogued the fragments, there was unease. Too many pages seemed untouched compared to the wreckage around them. Too many words carried uncanny detail. The survival of the diaries could be called coincidence once, but not again and again across multiple books belonging to different hands. Historians attempted to root the diaries, in fact. They compared the entries with wartime records, searching for consistency. They found names that aligned with casualty lists, accounts that matched troop movements, descriptions of raids that were supported by official reports. But they also found impossibilities. A child's notebook recorded a fire 3 days before it happened. A priest's entries listed villagers alive who had been dead for weeks. One diary spoke of soldiers who never entered the area at all, yet described them in precise detail. The insignias on their uniforms, the songs they sang while marching. Theories emerged that the villagers had copied rumors or written allegory to disguise their suffering, but the clarity of the writing defied simple invention. Paranormal researchers in later decades offered other explanations. They argued that the diaries were not merely preserved accounts, but vessels, objects that absorbed the experiences of their owners and continued to carry them forward. They pointed to strange occurrences during investigations, recorders capturing faint whispers when left overnight in rooms with the diaries, cameras flickering with bursts of light, though no source was present. One researcher described opening a volume to find fresh ink bleeding through the page, though the diary had been sealed in glass for decades. Skeptics dismissed such claims as exaggeration, yet the testimonies circulated, adding another layer of unease to the story. Others suggested that the villagers themselves had engaged in rituals during the final months of their lives, desperate to preserve themselves in some form. They noted the repetition of phrases, the symbols drawn in margins, the deliberate way words seemed arranged as if for a reader yet to come. Perhaps the diaries were not written only as testimony but as warnings, or even as anchors meant to keep something of the village alive long after the bodies had perished. No theory ever reached certainty. The diaries resisted explanation the same way they resisted fire. Some saw them as relics of trauma, fragments of memory burned too deeply to fade. Others saw them as supernatural artifacts, evidence that grief and fear can leave imprints stronger than flesh. But no matter the lens, the same fact remained. The voices survived when they should have been silenced. And those voices continued to speak, not just of what had happened, but of what was yet to come. The burned village never returned. Its ashes were swept by wind, its foundations swallowed by weeds, and its name erased from maps. Yet the diaries endured, fragile but unyielding, kept in archives and museums where they stead like quiet embers refusing to go out. Decades passed, but each time someone opened them, the fire returned in a different form. Readers spoke of a heaviness in their chest, a creeping unease, as if the words were more than memory. Some described the sensation of being addressed directly, as though the pages bent toward them, whispering across time. What unsettled most was not what the diaries revealed about the past, but what they seemed to say about the present, as if the village still existed somewhere beyond ruin, still watching, still waiting to be heard. The story of the diaries is not one of survival, but of refusal. The people of the village died, their homes were reduced to rubble, their fields were blackened, but their voices did not surrender. They clung to the margins of paper, to the ink that should have vanished in heat, and through those words they found a way to remain. In doing so, they unsettled the living. The diaries were not gentle reminders of lives lost. They were persistent, insistent, carrying dread forward. They blurred the line between past and present, forcing those who read them to confront the possibility that destruction does not always end a story. Sometimes it only changes its shape. The question that lingers is more unbearable than the fire itself. If words can survive when bodies do not, what else survives unseen? If memory can cling to paper with such weight, what does it cling to in the places we walk every day? Do ruins remember? Do the walls of houses echo with voices of the families who once slept beneath them? Do fields carry the cries of those who bled into their soil? If the village could speak through diaries, how many other places are still speaking through silence, waiting for someone willing to listen? Some archivists insist the diaries should be locked away forever, that they carry not only memory but contamination, a grief that spreads to those who touch it. Others argue they must be read, that forgetting would be the greater sin. But no consensus is reached, because each reader leaves with a different weight. Some leave convinced the diaries are warnings, others believe they are curses, and a few whisper they are invitations, that the dead are reaching for company. And so the ruins remain quiet, but the diaries keep whispering. If you open them, the voices do not feel like strangers. They feel close, uncomfortably close, as if they already know your name. Perhaps that is the final truth, that the words were not meant to record the past, but to call to the future, searching for ears to replace the ones burned away. If this story disturbed you, know there are more voices waiting in forgotten ruins, more histories that refuse to die. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel, because some words were never meant to be read, and the next ones might already be written for you.